Cannabis through the lifespan. Um, this is me. So if you don't know who I am, so I founded Plesio Health, or formerly Acute on Chronic, around 2019, 2020. Before then, I was an ICU nurse. I did some policy stuff for nursing mostly. I have half of a degree finished as a doctorate in nursing from Northern Illinois University that is now paused. I have a degree in women's health leadership from Rutgers, and I graduated from St. Xavier University. I also have a degree in communications and a minor in music and biology. So that's my background. I started this because I got frustrated that nobody was talking about valid science. Um, and patients were asking, and there were no answers. So here I am. And then we've grown since, and now we're Plesio Health. So, and if you stay all the way through the talk and invite your friends, there at the end, we're also going to be demoing our new dosing tool that has not been released. But if you join Illinois Women in Cannabis, you will have access to that and more access to us. So the history of cannabis medicine and female health, it was really women driven for a while. By a while, I mean a couple 3 to 5,000 years. So early China, it's used a lot in pain, midwifery. Hemp is first talked about in about 3000 before Common Era. We see it in the pharmacopoeia around 2000, but there's really a lot of use around 500 BCE. Around cannabis sativa is growing mostly in the Middle East and Asia and a little bit in Northern Africa. So we start seeing use around 700 AD in Uganda for male erectile dysfunction. We see it in India for sexual health, but mostly more religious prayer ceremonies as well. It is used in the Middle East, both in Jewish culture and across the three major monotheistic religions. So we see some of that. And you see some use from the Greeks and the Romans as well. So it is used around 1000 to 1800 Common Era by Europeans. The Pope really cracks down on it in 1300, except for a nun named Hildegard, who does write a lot of books about science. It does come to the Americas in the 1600s, but it's not an indigenous crop here. But hemp was a main export of the United States government up until 1937, and then they needed it again for World War II, but we've had prohibition about until 2018. So that's a super fast history, but there have actually been a lot of women who have been cannabis has been weaponized to, have them go to jail. They have been burned at the stake, accused of witchcraft. So it's a little bit of a precarious substance to use. It's still precarious, but hopefully it's getting less that way. So I just want to take a walk through cannabis use now and cannabis use back then. So 100 years ago, but even further back, I want to talk about women's health first, and then where cannabis was likely implemented. So if you've been to the doctor for anything that was kind of mild but didn't really show up on your tests or labs, you were probably diagnosed or close to diagnosed with anxiety. And I just want a disclaimer that generalized anxiety disorder and PTSD are very, very, very real. However, there are many women with other things going on that are just kind of blindly diagnosed with anxiety without any real workup involved, which kind of matches in the 1800s, early 1900s, women being diagnosed with hysteria. So this is where things get kind of funny regarding women's health. So I have the role of women in the 1800s for hysteria was to conform to rigid gender roles. Deviations were bad. Today, conforming to gender roles is optional, but there's a strong social pressure to provide unpaid domestic labor, care work. Traditional female occupations are encouraged, like teaching and nursing. Maybe you can have some PR, but you will get pushback if you try to do anything super non-traditional, construction, for example. And there is a stress from doing it all, but it is expected to be managed, and you can't talk about it. What are the symptoms for hysteria and the blindly overdiagnosed anxiety? Chronic pain, fatigue, GI issues, shortness of breath, lack of sex drive, depression, high stress, irritability, fainting, seizures. It's It's the same. And so like if you go to your doctor and you say you have chronic pain, fatigue, any of these things, there's a likelihood, especially if it's fainting or seizures, it might not be anxiety, particularly seizures. But as you could see, I wanted to put them head to head because I wanted to kind of call out how this overdiagnosis of like, oh, stress, anxiety is just new hysteria. It's it it's not even very creatively new hysteria. The diagnosis was a catch-all for unexplained symptoms in women. Anxiety is a diagnosis, a catch-all for unexplained symptoms in women. The bias that leads to this diagnosis is women are emotional and overreacting. They have a wandering womb. The bias for a anxiety diagnosis, oftentimes when they don't really look at anything else, is emotional, overreacting, too much stress. The treatment back in the 1800s and early 1900s was wait and see, do less, isolation, vibrators, procedures, and institutionalization. Treatment today is wait and see, do less. Sometimes you get an SSRI. The real issue was medical diagnosis was often overlooked, and this was mostly a punishment for deviating for social norms. Today, oftentimes, a real medical diagnosis is overlooked due to lack of research, but there is a withholding care that happens due to unconscious bias. Patients don't deserve to be worked up for this. They aren't good. They're drug seeking. They just have stress. She just wanted a break from her kids. Both the same. In both cases, cannabis actually was used and helpful, but I just want to highlight that the medical field has a long, long way to go, and a lot more research needs to be done. We haven't come that far in research for women or BIPOC communities since 1920. And a lot of research was unethically done on women and Black women. The entire foundation of obstetrics was literally groundbreaking gynecologist doing horrible, unethical things. So that's the beginning part of my talk about how this has been studied and what we can do now, but how not much has sadly changed since 1850. And it is Women's History Month, so I I would be silly not to kind of call out how we need to do so much better in so many different ways. So the endocannabinoid system, you may know or not know, but if you don't know, here's a real fast introductory. So we have this very cool system that lives within our central nervous system, newly discovered in 1990. It takes about 50 years to integrate something into healthcare. Um, but this has a stigma because the system has cannabinoid in the word. So it's probably going to take 75 to 100 years to see full adoption in. So we're about 30 years out. The ECS is located in every single organ system that we have. Various receptors, CB1, CB2, are everywhere. Some places they are more abundant than others. And other receptors that we did know about that are part of previous systems, neurological system, TRPV1 receptors, so on and so forth, also communicate with the system. So when you think of the ECS, the way to think of it is, and the way it's going to be and should be taught in the future, is it's an octopus. It definitely touches every single piece of our organ systems and cellular life. What makes plant cannabis unique is we do not have CB1 or CB2 receptors in our brainstem. A lot of ways that other pharmaceuticals, alcohol, benzodiazepines become dangerous to people is when you affect the brainstem, and that's why you stop breathing. Plant cannabis cannot do that to you. So there's a built-in protective mechanism. And I show this every time I talk about women's health or sexual health, where I promise you these CB1 and CB2 receptors are abundant. They are everywhere. They're in the placenta. They are in the fallopian tubes. They're in the endometrium. Everywhere. I wanted to make a note that as I go through this talk, it's important to highlight that there's even less research on binary people, the LGBTQ community, and trans people. This is sadly getting worse. Actually, the NIH was doing a study on cannabis with the LGBTQ community, and that grant funding was stopped. There was also somebody else doing research on LGBTQ community and substance abuse, which we know, being in the cannabis community, or even if you're entering the cannabis community, that substance abuse in cannabis it's not like other things. It is not even comparable to cocaine, heroin, anything. However, there was some research that could have pulled that out regarding substance abuse that got cut today too. So know that everything that I say in this talk has an asterisk, because for these communities, we truly don't know. Another asterisk is if you are not Caucasian, there's very little research that's been done aggressively as well. Most medical research, particularly in the pharmaceutical world, and a lot of the research we have is done on sativas and the pharmaceutical forms of cannabis. They were done on white European males between the ages of 25 and 55. So there's a lot we don't, and a lot of things left. This is important because trans and non-binary mental illness, and typically do have a higher rate of substance abuse. There's probably other co-founders, and that's what these researchers were looking into with the NIH. However, there could be a community. It could be for anxiety, depression, dysphoria, and PTSD. We know it is not um, um, trans and non-binary people also have increased health disparities and just poorer care across the board due to funding and so on and so forth. So higher cannabis use is reported among trans folks who have had gender-affirming care or surgery with hormones to help with the variety of things like PTSD, help with hot flashes from hormones, so on and so forth. So the first kind of moving a little bit of history and covered the cannabinoid system. Look in the chat too, if anybody wants to take a guess. I just learned this in September and I was shocked when I heard it, because in the cannabis community or about CBD, you typically hear a couple names thrown out and they're given credit for this whole thing. So I'll give you like too, if you're shy. Cellulose to do is it strives for homeostasis. So it strives what they're able to do to their optimization. So that's why you see these reports of cannabis doing so many different things. It's really complicated. It goes to a lot of hormones. It's kind of working with the hardware in the back, and it's pretty amazing. So I will give you the answer. So a lot of times the answer people typically yell out, I thought this too, is Dr. Raphael Mechoulam. But he didn't. It was actually discovered by women. CB1 was discovered, the CB1 receptor was discovered in 1988 by Dr. Alan Howlett. So we needed her to find that. And her work helped establish the endocannabinoid system and was fundamental for later work. And then Dr. Mary Abood discovered the CB2 receptor, which was crucial to discovering things like CBD and figuring out where it went, how it went. And her research was key for CBD treatments for autoimmune diseases and inflammation. And the first cannabinoid to ever be discovered was actually CBN, and it was actually in, I believe, the 17th century. So pretty interesting. I always thought it was Mechoulam, who's a fantastic scientist, but it's just funny how this happens in science, where the women do the work and sometimes a man who doesn't even want the credit for it will get it regardless of if they did it or want that credit or not. So what's tricky about cannabis and women and our life cycle, no matter what age you are, is there's a biphasic effect. So, and it's affected by things you eat, your diet, if you're exercising, what did you eat, other medications, past viruses, past trauma, genetics. So there's a lot of things at play of how you're dosing or what product you should use or what consumption method. The perfect way to dose cannabis is kind of in the middle. It's hard to find and it's not perfect for everybody. And we're going to talk about why. So, average dosing, sorry, it's not all synced pretty as a PowerPoint, but average dosing is kind of bonkers. And this does vary through the cycle. THC can go over 100 milligrams. Typically, it doesn't. Sometimes it can. CBD can go well in milligrams. Sometimes the dosing is milligram per kilogram, particularly things in PTSD or seizures. So a true clinical dose sometimes can be up to like 200, 300. But commercially, CBD is sold at 30 milligrams. Sometimes that works for very minor things, but I've found for big deal things, it should be higher, but then there's other complications that we'll talk about. And then CBG, my favorite cannabinoid, can be dosed from 2 milligrams to 80 milligrams. And these are just 3 out of the 162 cannabinoids that are out there. Consumption methods. So globally, there are 13 consumption methods. Applicable to today and rarely known about is actually vaginal and rectal suppositories. These need to be studied more because there's a hypothesis that perhaps vaginal has a systemic effect. There's a hypothesis that rectal does, perhaps they both do, but there is very likely a localized symptom relief without any euphoria or highness. So that's really good. The other kind of variable is not only do you have 13 routes, but um, but special for us today is the suppositories. There are medications that interact with cannabis. There's over 100. Caffeine is on here. Antibiotics are on here. Typical blood pressure medicines, typical cholesterol medicines, diabetes medicines. You can't really get out of a class of drugs that don't bump into cannabis. This could lead to uncomfortable side effects. It could also lead to your medication, the pharmaceutical, just not working anymore. So that's a pretty big deal. So this is why the conversation is so nuanced and really truly individual. So I'll start at the beginning. Zygotes, fetuses, babies, children, and young women. And I know I'm going through like 8 days of lectures and fast. So for fertility, women may not want to use cannabis if they are trying to conceive. There's some reasons why. Disrupted menstrual cycles, you have a shorter ovulation period, could. There is a little bit of disruption of hormone regulation possible with decreased estrogen and progesterone. We do see mostly a decrease in progesterone. Newer studies show that there's likely no change in estrogen until perimenopause or menopause. There is a decrease in estrogen there, which is, very different from this place in the life cycle. Is it something to worry about? Maybe. If you're looking for factors to remove if you're trying to conceive, it could be one that you could try. But we're also going to talk about how cannabis also helps with sexual health in a unique way. So it could be helpful. So everything in medicine is risk benefit, and everything in cannabis is weighing risk versus benefit. Because is cannabis the only thing that could mess up fertility for women trying to conceive? No. NSAIDs, SSRI, SRNIs, antibiotics, makeup, microplastics, endocrine disruptors in the food supply. And organic food is also sometimes rife with endocrine disruptors. So yeah, sometimes you kind of just have to, pick which risk you're going to take, remove certain variables, but it is up to the individual. And I just want to make a note that NSAIDs are ibuprofen, Aleve, that class of drugs, Motrin. Naproxen is actually one of the ones that might mess up fertility cycles the most, though. So moms and babies, what about pregnant women? what then? So right here in Chicago, Dr. Melanie Dreher is an RN and a PhD. She was actually one of the first to research this. It wasn't easy. She did this in the 80s and 90s. So she is a medical anthropologist. She focused on maternal health use in Jamaica. And how she got the study published was, I heard her lecture, she's brilliant. She essentially was like, these women use cannabis for religious reasons. We weren't asking them to use it, so there were not really ethical problems. We just were observing essentially what happened. So this work was done in the 80s and 1990s. And what's interesting is her work showed absolutely no differences between the babies that were born with maternal cannabis use nor without. Babies ended up the same. Now, we have few studies on this because things in pregnancy just aren't studied. In fact, 70% of the entire field, when they make recommendations, it's based off of other studies and kind of very conservative guessing. So I don't see this being researched much further beyond retrospective studies. So that's looking back or observational. We're never going to have randomized control trials here. In some few newer studies, the only really thing that was to look further in was a lower birth rate in mothers that used medical cannabis early in their pregnancies for nausea and vomiting. However, it should be noted that this was possibly due to other co-founding factors. Some of the women that were a part of the study that was done at University of Illinois, Chicago, some of these women had previous diagnoses of things like PTSD, bipolar disorder, previous substance abuse with alcohol, or they were in abusive relationships, or they were single mothers. They were low income. So there were things about stress, having a difficult life that could have had to do with this. They also, many of them had something called hyperemesis. That's when you throw up a lot. It should be noted that a low birth rate was also seen when patients use something called Zofran. So what could be better for women? And if these women are self-medicating anyway for a variety of reasons, perhaps we should take a closer look at cannabis if it has the same risks of some of the other traditional drugs. So it's important to note that the lower birth rate found was possibly due to other things, but we can't rule it out. So that is a possibility. Plus, there just might be more we don't know. I cannabis, but I recommend parents do that for a prescription drug or supplement their child recommended. The developed brain recreational cannabis does have some downsides. That's where we see elevated levels of cannabis hyperemesis syndrome, for example. But I wouldn't give any different advice that I would give if somebody's child was recommended to go on a medication for ADHD or a medication for a different chronic illness. It's just about risk and benefit for your child. And just know that there's very little studies on pharmaceuticals for children. And so there's also very little studies on cannabis. So you kind of pick and choose, but it's always good to sometimes children need medication or a supplement, and that's okay. And I want to be really highlight to destigmatize that because I know sometimes there's a lot of people who are hesitant to any type of medication for their child, but sometimes it is the best thing to do. Typically, overall, I generally avoid adult use consumption until the age of 25 when the brain is completely formed. That being said, as a recreational substance, cannabis is better as a safety profile compared to anything else a teen or adolescent could experiment with if they're going to experiment. I will also say on the medical side, currently, at least for adults, medical cannabis also has a better safety profile than a majority of supplements and prescription medicine. So children do have a naive ECS. So know that if somebody is using medical cannabis as a teen or a child, they actually can consume more without any euphoria, which is pretty fascinating. And one thing I want to highlight here is, and I'm going to explain this. So a lot of the pushback against why medical cannabis should be strict, why we can't have it, why it's Scheduled 1, pearl clutching about recreational cannabis is because of this constant citing of like, what about schizophrenia? What about, does it trigger schizophrenia? This is what the studies say. So correlation is not causation. So just because something is happening and happening a lot does not mean that is the likely cause. You actually have to prove that that is the cause. The schizophrenia is diagnosed a majority of the time in adolescence. So it starts appearing typically around the ages of 13, 19, is an age that has a lot of children in that age group get diagnosed with schizophrenia, and then typically until the age of 30. Well, when are kids experimenting with cannabis, medical cannabis, recreational cannabis? When is that first introduced? Typically around the teen years. So it seems to me, granted, there's more studies, but there haven't been any true hardcore studies that really make this connection that it's a cause. It seems to be that these two things are just happening at the same time. Now, there is some correlation with cannabis potentially having the symptoms of schizophrenia show up earlier, which should not be discounted and is something to discuss. But there has currently been no proof that it absolutely causes adolescent schizophrenia or causes schizophrenia, period. Probably a correlation. And so for early adulthood, menstruation, and for more fertility and health. So a woman's life cycle matters. So CBD, THC, other cannabinoids, like I talked about, can affect estrogen levels, but it depends on where in the life cycle you're using it. And product dosing depends on where a woman is in her life cycle and even where she is in her 28-day cycle. So your monthly cycle does matter. I wrote these kind of cliff notes. So the kind of basic to remember is THC absorption around ovulation you'll get more, but I'll show you a chart. It'll make it easier to understand. After the last time I did this talk, I was like, I need to make a chart. But then less absorption while you have your period. So take a look. Oh, wait, where is it? Hold on. I'll go back. Okay, I'll go back to that slide. So this is the chart. So this is so fascinating. So when you use cannabis day 1 through 5, when you have your period and the uterine lining is shedding, studies show that THC does not have as much effectiveness. So here you could technically consume more. Other variables do matter here as well, but overall, this is what the studies show. And then it looks like these you could use a little less. Day 13 to 15, probably the least amount of cannabis you have to use, particularly THC, to get the most effect. Now, this is done on pain, but we could make assumptions that it probably has the same effect for other symptoms or just for recreational use. And then we see in the last couple days, 23 through 25, it goes down again. So this is so crazy because during the cycles of the moon, how much cannabis we use changes. So technically, if somebody uses a 5 milligram gummy for pain throughout their 28-day cycle, technically to optimize, they could kind of play around with dosing there, save money, save time, probably reduce side effects. So an important component of pain relief from menstrual cramps, terpenes, linalool, eucalyptol, beta-caryophyllene. Myrcene is in practically every strain and distillate you have in the state of Illinois. So myrcene helps with a lot, but we're not getting rid of it. So it's there, it helps. Limonene also helps. So during menstruation, and we're going to see this come into play later with menopause, cannabis use can reduce something called FAAH inhibitors that have anti-anxiety effect. This is probably what causes the cascade of decreasing estrogen, which I say there. How do you use cannabis for menstruation? So this is where suppositories are great. This is where even localized topicals are great. Edibles, great. So you could do local for when you have to be at work. If you've never used a suppository before, probably don't try that one if you have to be awake during the day. If it has any THC in it, or if you're sensitive to CBD, but those are all ways you could try them. And you should have relief. Um, Here's my chart again. And so sexual activity. So this is really fascinating. So the effects on sexual health for women are profound. So cannabis use before having a sexual encounter, women report a 2.13 higher odd of having a satisfactory orgasm. More frequent cannabis use anytime, not before an encounter, so gave similar odds to a satisfactory orgasm. I took the slide out because I'd be talking to you for hours, but essentially, there was a 2017 study by Dr. Sun that showed that women who use cannabis have more sex on average than women that do not. And this is for a variety of reasons that we're going to see here. Sexual experience, typically enhanced. Sex drive, enhanced. Orgasms, enhanced. I never say this word right. Dyspareunia, that's painful sex, decreased. Women feel better. Anxiety goes down. And then here's this is the sample of how we can tell that cannabis works to optimize every single cell. So a side effect of cannabis is dried mucous membranes in the epithelial tissue. So in your mouth, we have epithelial tissue, right? And so people get dry mouth, you get dehydration. So you can and should drink a lot of water. It's the same epithelial tissue in our vulva and vaginal cavity. And yet, lubrication is unchanged. That does not go with how cannabis typically works. So as you can see, plant-based cannabis is there to optimize our endocannabinoid system, which really wants to optimize every single cell and organ system, including having some features much like Viagra and Cialis, where you do see something called vasodilation, which is the opening up of arteries to blood flow to the reproductive organs when cannabis is often used. So that's really fascinating. And it also causes hypotension. So be careful. Oh, I didn't take the slide out. So I probably actually left it saying new slide. I wanted to change this, but this is the research that shows that in women and men, frequent cannabis use equals frequency in sex. Even for men, it was a little higher in women, actually. And so, why does cannabis have this positive effect for women? We actually don't know, but it's probably because of how the optimization on the cellular level works. Plus, if the pharmaceutical company had tried, and they have, to make a pill, women and female sexual problems typically go well beyond just a physical anatomical problem. Our problems are truly things like a running to-do list, stress, the caregiving of children, things like that. It's a much more complicated problem. But cannabis probably could be a little bit of a magic bullet here because of how it's doing many things at one time and really optimizing. Other reasons why this could be: it lowers sexual inhibitions, it does increase feelings of confidence and willingness to experiment. I certainly have talked to so many women that say one of the reasons why they utilize cannabis, particularly after they have children, is it seems to the frontal lobe, it seems to really boost confidence and be like, wait a minute, I am hot, I look great. Somatic sensations are increased, which means you are more confident. You're like, hey, I look fly, but also tastes are tastier. That's why we get the munchies. Sounds sound better. Things feel better. All sensory things are enhanced. So that helps. The other thing that helps is cannabis slows our temporal sensation of time. So that's time dilation. If you've ever used cannabis and you're like, wow, I've been sitting here for an hour watching this movie and it's only been 5 minutes, that's time dilation. Typically, an average sexual encounter in America is less than 7 minutes. So, which probably not our fault. But um, so slowing of time, even though you're still having the same 7-minute encounter with cannabis, probably feels like 15, 20, 30 minutes. Um, and plus, the lower stress and anxiety cannot be ignored. And then no changes to vaginal secretions is huge. Perimenopause and menopause. So my favorite joke in cannabis. Remember in the 90s, if you're between 30 to 40 years old, like I am, they used to say, McGruff the crime dog and Dare, cannabis will not make you cool. It does. It does. It actually decreases um, our internal temperature. So it does cause hypothermia, which is clutch when you're having hot flashes. So that is a really useful mechanism. And the hot flashes, again, this is going way back to the first slide about women's health is just not paid attention to and hasn't been. And so women have been having menopause literally since the dawn of time. It used to mean that you were an elevated woman in earlier societies. And now it's become weirdly stigmatized, but we should all be celebrated and congratulated for living that long. But also in older cultures, it used to be celebrated because now there were older, wise women who didn't have little children that could contribute to their community. And so it was celebrated widely. So I hope we can all change the paradigm back to celebrating widely. Um, and be knowledgeable, older women about life and helpful. And so it does lower the body temperature. So some of these symptoms, this is the point I was trying to make, um, they could be really terrifying and feel bad. And we're not told that. So hot flashes don't mean like, oh, geez, I'm hot. People pass out from hot flashes. You could get crazy nauseous. You could vomit from hot flashes. You could get these intense migraines if you have migraines. They typically heat up during menopause. Um, so, um, some things that cannabis can help with, not just the hot flashes, is nausea, sleep, vomiting, increasing appetite. It also helps significantly with anxiety. CBD is an agonist of the 5-HT1A receptor, which is what your medicine like Prozac, Axon, this was actually the same molecule discovered for that. And ta-da, it actually helps with serotonin reuptake. So this is a big reason also why it helps with menopause symptoms. There seems to be a ramping up of anxiety, probably, because of hormones. I hear it's like puberty, but all over again and more intense. Um, Between the ages of 35 and 50, and it does last about perimenopause actually starts a couple of years before active menopause. So yeah, it does a lot of things. It's kind of a one-stop shopping. And so if I had more time, but I want to take questions if you had them. I just want to then add, which is probably a whole different talk because there's all sorts of nuances, but cannabis in the older adult postmenopause, it has a lot of benefits for sexual health. Then you get into pains, then you get into neurological brain health, vaginal dryness, more sexual health, pain. Cannabis can help with a whole host of, disease processes related to the reproductive system, PCOS and endometriosis. It's probably one of the only things we don't have any treatments for endometriosis right now. And oftentimes that diagnosis is missed, but cannabis seems to be the thing that really helps people there. So I'd love to see more research there. Um, PMDD, it could be quite helpful in. So a wide variety of things, not to mention really terrible and serious chronic illnesses or disease processes, cancer, ovarian cancer, uterine cancer. There's a lot of probably benefit through chemo and radiation that somebody can get while using cannabis at the same time, but it depends because of all of the medication interactions. So I like to go over some safety precautions, especially if you are a newer or naive user, but even for the OGs, products matter, and sometimes you take an edible and it's the same milligram allotment you've taken and it's just a different time in your cycle, and then you feel like hell. So here's how to keep safe and happy and to minimize side effects, increase better therapeutics. Don't mix alcohol and cannabis. Pick a lane. If you are drinking, if you go to a wedding and you're a medical cannabis user, if you can, pause products at least for that part of the day. Try not to drink more than 1 to 2 drinks. Always see how THC and CBD affects you before any sexual encounters. Talk about consent, talk about rules. If you are totally new to cannabis or trying a totally new dose or product, try that first dose at home and give yourself 12 hours. Don't drive, don't operate heavy machinery. I know you might be aware of more somatic sensations. Side effects of cannabis are dehydration, increased heart rate, and that increased heart rate can feel scary. You can get up to 150 beats per minute average sitting. 60 to 70, 80, 90 beats per minute is normal-ish. So it could really pop up there. Ways to mitigate side effects: stay hydrated, take a hot shower bath as long as you don't feel dizzy. Sometimes using spices, peppercorns, lemon rind can dampen it. The old science used to be match CBD with THC to mitigate high. That's actually starting to be disproven. I read a study where CBD ratios can actually make it worse and cause side effects. So that's fascinating. I'm interested to see where that science goes. And then finding the right products. 80% of the CBD market is fraudulent. This is from a 2017 study. I feel like with the hemp market booming, we're probably at 80 or more. Synthetics are not the same as plant cannabis. So THCP, THCO, THC delta 10, whatever you see. This entire lecture doesn't count for those. They are essentially pharmaceuticals that we have no idea what they do. So I would avoid those. But the market's gotten a little different since they last studied this. Watch for ingredients, watch for extraction methods. If it is extracted with butane and all that butane's not pulled out and it's left, when you heat butane on fire, it becomes benzene, which is carcinogen. That and vitamin E oil could be part of what causes EVALI. Sometimes no solvent means hash ice extracted, good. Sometimes solventless means propane, bad. So it really depends. And medical considerations, always check your labs at least once to twice a year. If you're using cannabis weekly, CBD can pop up your liver enzymes. Typically it's nothing, but they go back down, but you want to know. And then, you know, cannabinoids, just like that big post I showed with all the different medications. What does it do to medications? It depends. Some medications it makes go up. Some medications it makes work less effectively. Some medications it completely stops them from working. So always double check with somebody to be sure that there's no interactions between your medications. Plesio can help you do that for $25. And if you have a parent that you're trying to get, or grandparent, or aunt, or uncle, or friend that you're trying to slowly get them to perhaps think about cannabis, that service that we offer is a great way. We can check medications, even if you're not using cannabis. And we actually fixed somebody's heart failure. They were having bad numbers, and it's because we discovered they were taking their beta blocker incorrectly. They were taking it once a day. They were supposed to take it twice a day. And they did that for 10 years, but we fixed him. So no cannabis needed there. So that is us. Um, I have time to take questions and I would love to. And then after the Q&A, if you want to stick around, or we could pause the recording and then do the Q&A, I would be happy to show our soon precision dosing tool that can be used for menopause and sexual health that you all get as members of Illinois Women in Cannabis.
I'd love to do the Q&A really quickly, and then in
Sure.
the chat, so you can either choose to raise your hand and mute yourself to ask your questions. In the chat, I am going to just quickly throw in a survey link. So for everyone who did attend today, please fill out the survey. Your feedback will help us curate future content for these types of events. So if there's other subject matter that you're interested in hearing about, your feedback is going to be helpful for us to make that into a future virtual education. So I just added that to the chat. Please feel free to fill that out. But if anyone has questions, feel free to throw it out.
There are no silly questions. Even if you have a question about anything historical, I'm down to answer it.
I can't figure out how to raise my hand, so forgive me. But Rebecca, thank you so much for this. One question that I have is I have a series of women in my life experiencing menopause, and I saw that on that slide you wrote that too little causes hyper, and then too much causes hypo. What is kind of like a good rule of thumb for women that are hoping to mitigate hot flashes to support, that kind of stage of their life?
Yeah. Because this is where like the and physicians get agitated with me too. It depends. One of the things we noticed when working with women, but it's never really a hard and fast rule, we noticed that CBD, particularly in the evening time, seems to, in some women, it actually caused us to like change how we dose it. It seems to exacerbate symptoms at night, which is very strange. So we've started putting things like CBD in particular in the morning time because we suspected that we were driving the estrogen maybe down and it was exacerbating symptoms. So I would say this is where probably microdosing becomes best practice, particularly for menopause. I think here less might be more. Um, but I think that's the rule mostly for women who have kind of no other medications, no other healthcare issues. If it's just like menopause, that's what really helps.
So kind of microdosing THC throughout the day and then CBD in the morning. Is that kind of the idea?
That's it. And I would say throughout the day, if somebody is having like really strong symptoms during the day, yeah. And even at night, I would say microdosing is probably best practice. This is the one I'm tempted to say, like, this is my little like nuanced, like, well, no detail untouched. I will say that if they're having like aggressive symptoms of anxiety or some sort of other discomfort, that you can move up on the THC, so you can have kind of a bigger microdose. So that's where the nuance lies, because we've noticed, one day I want to study it, that if you are having an increase in symptoms, that your THC dosing will not cause euphoria. You won't feel high, and you technically need more of a dose. It's so interesting. So I would say like mild to moderate symptoms, I would say CBD in the morning, other cannabinoids, microdose. There is a variation though in that microdose, just to keep that open. And but if you're having more severe symptoms, you're probably leaning on the higher end of microdosing, if not like really going for it at the end of the day.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Yeah. And then Shay, I just want to be sure I can answer because you directed messaged me, but I'm fine with it. There's a question about soon to be moms. Are you fine if I answer it?
I just didn't want to forget the question. It was something that I've been seeing mostly on social media, some pretty controversial opinions about consumption during pregnancy. Very out
Yeah.
of the blue, just kind of wondering from your professional perspective if that's more just like people being people on social media or if that's actually factually based. If
Yeah. So is like the buzz on social media that like a lot of people are using cannabis now during pregnancy, or that it's has the public opinion changed to like very good or like
More, I've only seen it because I have like a 1-year-old niece and my sister's pregnant, and so we often talk about it because she doesn't smoke, and I'm always thinking like, oh, okay, but if you did, like, what would this mean? So I've seen a little bit on my socials that people are saying that they are going to use cannabis during pregnancy because it's helping the mom, therefore it's helping the baby, but they didn't have any like, oh, it actually regulates this, which therefore helps me during the pregnancy. I was just kind of wondering if that's more just social media or if there's actually evidence in that.
Yeah. So unfortunately, there's, like I said, there's very little evidence. There's the study that was done in the 90s, and then you see these like teeny tiny studies pop up. There's really no, like the medical industry's recommendation and nursing, overall, it's still a no. I think my opinion here is actually, it's going to surprise you because I'm a cannabis nurse. It's actually also, I'm a probably not, and I don't judge any, my policy is like no judgment ever. If a woman was using it for symptoms instead of something else, um, I would probably be like, oh, I don't know about that, because just because the lack of research is, it gives me pause.
It's
What
so
really
scary.
scares the hell out of me is actually the quality of products. And essentially like how there's this like complete deregulation of the hemp industry. So
Mhm.
if I were to see a patient in clinic and they said that, I think if we were talking about plant cannabis, I'd be a lot more like, like, like you're the patient, like, for sure, your body, your choice is like, I'm 100% on there. Everybody, I feel like everybody can make their own decisions with informed consent for sure. And especially like cannabis. Um, and so that's like overall where my opinion is. The biggest worry I have is the unregulated products, because truly doctors don't know, patients don't know, nurses don't know, the cannabis industry itself doesn't know the difference between Delta 8, THCP, blah, 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 blah. So it's those like scary kind of unknown zombie molecules that are being advertised as plant cannabis. That's what actually worries me probably more than anything. Because if a pregnant woman came to me and was like, "Hey, I'm using I'm using this synthetic, it's HHC," I would be like, "No, no, no, stop right now, don't do it." Or if it was like hemp, so and then there's like nuances in the words, and if it was a THC molecule that was made in a lab, not extracted from hemp, that would give me a lot of pause too. So the lack of research, I don't love. Um, but yeah, I don't think it's ever going to be accepted by the medical community. Even though I can see a benefit for essentially the morning sickness, the vomiting, you have a lot of pain during pregnancy. Breastfeeding, I'm a lot more liberal on. I think if you are a woman having depression, anxiety, all sorts of things, chronic pain, anything during that period, I think there's a lot more room in breastfeeding to actually probably give cannabis, particularly the non-THC cannabinoids, a go. Um, Even CBD during pregnancy, I think like just because the world and country is so conservative about childbearing women, I think that's where my like hesitancy comes from. Also, having been in case management, and seeing how not all women are created equal in healthcare, I also would be hesitant to give my full endorsement because even though we know cannabis is not the same and as cocaine or blah 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 blah, again, I'm a informed consent, your body, your choice kind of person. Um, there are still places in this country and hospitals that will take children away for pregnant women testing positive on a test after they have give birth, even in legal states. So this, of course, affects lower income women first and foremost. But then if, you know, already, if you are not a white woman giving birth in America, you're at much higher risks to not get the care you should have. And this just adds another reason for the medical staff to be biased. And also weaponize DCFS. So I think it's a lot of like social factors also that make me worried about it. But yeah, I hope, sorry, that was a very long-winded answer that I had. So I hope that
No,
kind
that's
of
perfect.
explains
I
it.
think it's always good to get a professional's perspective, especially when social media can get so flooded. And unfortunately, especially my generation, that's where we see a lot of things and that's where a lot of conversations begin. So it's really nice to get your perspective and then hear the longevity of it a little bit. So thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, no problem. And yeah, I mean, if I were a betting woman and we actually had studies, I would love to see actually cannabis go head to head with like Zofran, or Tylenol in pregnancy. I bet if we, you know, if some country somewhere was brave enough to actually do these studies, I feel like cannabis again would have the better safety profile. So that's my bet. But of course, I feel like, you know, it's even I'm probably a product of where I, you know, my training as well, but I get conservative about it. And I'm pretty liberal too when it comes to like pregnancy. Like, you know, I ate lunch meat. I ate I ate sushi very small towards the end. So yeah. And then Natalie has a question.
Oh, sorry. I was trying to get the unmute to work. So, first of all, thank you for doing this.
No problem.
And then my question was just kind of piggybacking back off of her question because I agree, just working in this industry and just having all different people that I've met, I've had some women talk about how their journey into cannabis was because of addiction to other things. So then during their pregnancy, um, you know, everybody has their own different story, but like, for example, one woman, she told me about how she was pretty much just only using edibles during her pregnancy. And, you know, her son is doing great now. I'm happy everything worked out. But I always am just curious about that as well, because it's like, I can never fully recommend it without the science to back it. Um, and I'm also just so curious of how they could ever do those studies because you know, you always hear about some women saying like, "Oh, I had a water birth at home when I was drinking wine and it was a great time." But it's such conflicting information. So I was just trying to see your opinions. I know I've heard of like the study with the low breathing rate. I've read that one, but it also didn't seem like it made a lot of sense either, just based on the number of people they were doing it.
Huh. I haven't read the any like low breathing rate, but I'm gonna check it out. So if you know, if somebody, and I would love to see this studied, and it's a shame, unfortunately, I doubt it will be because we don't like the culture, I would say internationally, but much more in America, we do not test pharmaceuticals on pregnant women. And what's sad is even when pregnant women are in the hospital, like people are terrified to touch them. Like you could have something really going wrong and the entire physician team will be like, "Oh, but they're pregnant." So we have a very, well, you know, we all live in America. We have a very like fetus forward, essentially healthcare system. So those studies are going to be hard to find. Um, but I would be interested to hear somebody who practices like gynecology or OB, regarding substance abuse, but trying to go away from heroin, opioids, other, you know, again, this cannabis does not belong in that family, but it, you know, because of 75 years of stigma, it is. Um, I think most healthcare professionals would say, you know, okay, so the standard is like, don't do anything while you're pregnant, like drink water, you know, do nothing, eat fruit. Like be your healthiest self is like the American recommendations, right? Um, if somebody is saying, yeah, I have no idea what an OB would say because if I'm not a physician, nor am I practice anything having to do with gynecology. I think if a woman said to me on the street, like, I had an opioid addiction and the only thing that stops that is cannabis, I would be like, yeah, that's the better choice, you know? Um, yeah, because even I think opioids are mostly like a class C, if I have it remember correctly. I think just a lot of people get spooked by the unknown. I mean, like we know for sure some of the kind of dangerous street drugs, um, cannabis, again, plant cannabis, probably safer would be the bet. Um, I think even see, I like feel my own like, oh, like it makes me nervous. I think because of the lack of research and the lack of regulation on like for sure the hemp side. I think that's what makes me hesitant to say that like we should definitely do this because we just don't know. Particularly like things like smoking or like vitamin E oil, um, the fungus that could happen in cannabis. All sorts of weird things happen during pregnancy too. I also would not like the bias to come in and swoop up anybody. So yeah, I think I'm sorry. Another nuanced, it depends, and I wish there was more research. Um, yeah, I didn't know this was like you tell my children are older because I'm like out of the pregnancy hot topics. The algorithm does not talk to me about this. Um, I still think it's a probably not, try not to, but however, um, if you can't keep food down and you're hospitalized, I think it's worth a conversation with your doctor, but come informed always. Be like, this is the risks of Zofran, this is the risks of cannabis. And if you go head to head with like risks of Compazine, Zofran, cannabis, especially if you are getting so sick that it's a detriment to you or your baby, I think it's definitely worth the conversation. Just I would say go in prepared. And that's what I would recommend probably to consumers too. Go in prepared and know your doctor's probably going to say no because they're trained to say no to anything. I mean, turkey sandwich, you're hard pressed, right, to like have like a turkey and cheese sandwich when you're pregnant in America. And oh, I will say this is important. The most important time to stay away from anything that's unknown is the first 14 weeks because that's when everything is building, the bones, the organs, like the vital things, brain, organ, heart, blah, 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 is during that first 14 weeks. After week 14, there's a lot of growing that happens from that point on. So I would definitely say try not, make no sudden moves, make no changes, don't add anything extra. If I would say avoid using cannabis during those 14 weeks for sure, for sure, for sure. I think that's why you see people having a glass of wine month 9 is because it's all growing and the baby's on its way out. So you could be a little more liberal with breaking the rules towards the end, but in the beginning, week 1 through 14, that's the time to be as conservative as possible.
Thank you. No, I agree and I appreciate everything you said. That's my mindset as well.
Thanks. These are great questions. So I know they're super nuanced. Any other questions? Awesome. Cool. And then please fill out the form and let us know what kind of topics you would like moving forward. I would love, love, love to see them and take your recommendations. Um, there's so many things you could talk about in cannabis. I could probably do a multi-day lecture. I won't, but I could.